I was just going to say, we were also going to invite our junior hires to go, but they're gone. So let's tell our junior hires we love them like they're still here. Woo! Go junior high! Weston, thanks for sharing, man. That was awesome. And you know, Weston has a really interesting story. And his story is that a friend invited him and then left him hanging dry and didn't show up. But what I heard was with a 100% success rate, that works. So I want to invite you. to you know, this is a great space, and I hope it touches your life. And invite your friends, and then if you don't come, that's okay, because they'll keep coming back. It's Student Serve Sunday. We've got students. They serve all the time in the life of this church. It's one of our 5 pillars, but today is a day where they ramp that up. They're obviously all over the band, serving in Kid Mission, greeting, helping behind the scenes. So we love having our teenagers involved around here. And if you're new with us today, I want to welcome you. My name's Carlos, and we're in the final 2 weeks of a study we started this fall on this thin little book from the Bible called the Book of James. It's called the Book of James because it's written by a half-brother of Jesus, an early leader in the life of the church. And James wrote this as a way to talk to people following Jesus. That's his primary audience. Now, if you're not a follower of Jesus, I still think there's loads of wisdom that we can pull out of this. But his primary audience was people who he said, look, you've seen the good life and the way you should live, and you're missing it. And he invited folks to consider what the difference would be. Now, today's message that James has for us that I'm going to share. That sounds so weird, like James told me and I'm telling you. Today's message that just impacted me out of the book of James really deals with the idea that you and me, don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And I think we intuitively know that. We're like, yeah, and then we spend our lives ignoring that reality. But that came home big time for me last Saturday night as I lay in bed and thought, tomorrow morning, I'm going to be the proud owner of nearly $2 billion. Now, some of you were there too. We were in competition. We didn't even know. And I'm like, so Emily and I are laying there, and then my wife's so generous, and within 10 minutes, we've given all of our winnings away. And I'm like, we got to keep a little for ourselves. And then we turn the conversation to, what would you be willing to give up to get this? And I immediately went to both my arms. I don't know why I went there, but it seemed like a worthwhile trade. I'm like, you know what? Like, take them both if I can get the $2 billion. And I turned to her, and I thought she'd be like, yeah, and my legs. But she's like, just my left hand. So we kind of went to bed with this tension. I felt like she wasn't as invested as I was in winning this money. Then we woke up, and we didn't win. So newsflash, and you didn't win either, I'm pretty sure, because you weren't in California at the time, in Altadena, I think. And yes, I do play Powerball every time it gets up to a high number. I'm just confessing. My question for you is, because we're going to talk about tomorrow. So here's the deal. I still have both my arms because I have no control over what happens tomorrow. It's a good thing I didn't preemptively go, well, maybe if I get rid of these, I don't know how I'm going to do that one. Maybe if I get rid of these, then I'll win, okay? So what would you give to win $2 billion? Maybe it's a body part. Maybe it's, I don't know, your favorite. I don't know. But you're going to turn to your neighbor, and you're going to answer this question. We do this a couple times on a morning. Some of them are like this. Some are a little deeper. But turn to the person next to you. If you're sitting alone or you don't know the person, turn and do that awkward eye contact where you gauge if you want to talk to each other or not. And if you mutually don't, just kind of nod at each other and go on. All right, so here's the question. Go ahead, you get 1 minute. It's not complicated. What would you give?
Different city every night. Oh, I swear the world better prepare for when I'm a billionaire.
Yeah, I would have a show like Oprah. I would be the host of everyday Christmas. You track your wish list. I probably pull an Angelina.
You get like 5 seconds to answer this. All right, listen. It's really black and white. You turn to the person next to you and you say, I would give both my arms. And then you say, what would you give? And you answer. And you may disagree, but it's a good thing. Like when you think about what James is getting at, when it comes to like Powerball, we all know, like the odds are impossible. And if you buy 2 tickets, they don't double. I've learned that from my wife who's good at math. So if you buy 2 tickets, it's not like it doubles your chance, right? None of us went to bed who thought about this, went to bed thinking, I'm probably gonna win. Chances are good. We knew we had no control. But there's so many other areas in our lives that we'll jump in and we'll be like, well, yeah, I control this. But if we look at the scope of our lives, even if we're young, we look at the scope of our lives, we're like, well, actually, no. And that's what James is going to get at today. I want to test that hypothesis. How much control do we really have? And how does it play out in our lives, and in particular, in a life of faith? Because James's argument from the beginning was this: we're all searching for the good life. How do I know I've lived? And then he turns and goes, you keep thinking it's this life that ends with horizontal comparison. How do I stack up to you? And he turns and goes, no, it's a life of comparing ourselves to a good God who's totally unlike us. He's holy and he's perfect and he's good. And when we stack up to that, we realize, we fall short. And then we're left with the question, what do we do? And Jesus says, I've done it for you. That's the message of James. And then it touches every area of our lives. And so I was trying to think about this reality. I wrote it down like this. If you and I have a relationship with Jesus, every aspect of our lives can and will be changed. How I spend my life as a whole, my time, my affections, my relationships, how I view my plans, my purpose, my politics, my money, my enemies, my friendships, my power, my suffering. And what's really interesting about following Jesus is it's an invitation to follow a suffering God, a God who knows what it's like to suffer. Very interesting to wrap your head around and think about. Jesus Christ suffered. In this room, we suffer. We'll bounce in and out of suffering this morning, but there are stories of suffering, and some of them are lighter, and some of them are heavy, but we all have them, and they will come and go, and they will change in our lives because we don't control what tomorrow brings. And so I wanted to visually represent this. Not a new idea, but my drawing is new and very fancy. So there's 2 ways. James is going to basically test something. He's going to say there's a way we do it, and there's a way God invites us to do it. The way we do it, maybe you agree with this. I want you to think about it as that it's me. I am the one who has the care and concern over my life. And you know what? I want to grow up, so I drew this person climbing stairs. I'm like, I want to get an education or a job, and I want to keep becoming whatever that next step of my life is. And so there's that part, and it's in the me. This is my life. And then there's my heart, my affections, my emotions. There's my well-being and my health. There's my community and my sense of being rooted. And you could fill in more things. This is just what came to mind for me. There's money and my resources. I tried to draw a key because I thought it was a good symbol, but it just looks like the top mouth of an alligator. So I wasn't very good. I drew that a lot of times, by the way. And then I was like, and then what happens is we're like, oh, and you know what? I found faith. I am a follower of Jesus. Me, and Jesus fits into my globe of my life. And that's whether we think deeply about it or not, that's often where we find ourselves. This is the center or the core, the surrounding of our life that keeps it all together is me. And James is going to say, well, but what if you're missing it? What if this only works as long as it works and you don't know when it will stop working? It could be market news. It could be an inflation. It could be a relationship. It could be like the entirety of your life that you thought was something getting pulled out from under you. And the people you trusted weren't who you thought they were. And like this is the stuff many of you walk in and day out. So James goes, what if your life is actually under the care and concern of God? It's God's world. All of it is lived under his care and concern. And in that world exists our community and our sense of rootedness, our alligator mouth, our emotions, the relationships we have and the things we connect with, what we hope for in life. I'll call this like our successes. They're different for all of us. Our well-being, our money. And what's interesting is in the world of God's care and concern, Jesus sits at the center of it as the gravitational pull. These are not just 2 different versions of the same thing. James doesn't think so. I think a lot of you have wrestled with this and know they're not. It's not just moving things around. One is dependent on my ability to hold it together. One, I am dependent on God. 2 very different approaches. I want to put it to you maybe in a few contrasting quotes. One is from a philosopher and theologian. His name was Dallas Willard. And Dallas said, I've edited it a little bit for readability, but he said our most likely source of failure is to follow ourselves. So the only safety is to have no other will, no other wisdom than to follow Jesus wherever he leads. And this was Dallas Willard thinking about how are you supposed to live what's the good life look like? Now contrast that with, like, if you're familiar with maybe the movie or maybe the poem Invictus, very powerful line that doesn't quite capture the poem. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Now, doesn't that feel inspiring? Don't you want to wake up and say that to yourself every day? Like, look in the mirror and just go, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. But here's the challenge. James is going to go, ooh, be real careful because you're actually not. Life is not under your control. And we just do a little thought exercise and we could probably start to stack up all the events in our lives that just showed up one day. So that brings us to James and what he's going to have for us. He's going to compare these two and he's going to invite us to an idea. This is going to be the idea. A life of following Christ, a Christian life would look like this, that you plan under the guidance of God, that you plan your life under the guidance of Jesus, that you live your life. So it's not just plan, there's a live. You live your life under the guidance of God. And then you allow this to affect every, not some, not part of, every aspect of your life. James walks us in. We're going to be in James chapter 4, verses 13, starting at verse 13, picking up where Katie left us off last week. And then we wrap up the James conversation next week as we get ready to turn towards our Christmas season. So chapter 4, verse 13, if you've got your journal Bible, you can follow along. If you don't have one, that's okay. We gave these out in the very beginning, but everything will be on the screen that you need to see. Okay, so James begins with this. Chapter 4, verse 13, he says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit. Now just look at this sentence real quick. It feels like life, doesn't it? He's saying, look, you who made a plan about tomorrow, you're going to go in this place, you're going to go here, you're going to do this, you're going to earn this. And the topic of of this letter right now is going to kind of be around business and money and earning, but that's just a framework to think about all of life. So he starts off with this and says, tomorrow we will go into such and such a town. And then James turns, and if you've been here for any of this conversation, he does this all the time. Then he turns and says, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. And the logical next thing to say to somebody, what is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. I wonder what it'd be like if James had social media. That would have been fascinating. Then he goes, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Even when I read this, I'm like, what? That's the solution? I go, if the Lord wills, but he's going to give some depth and some grit to this idea. Because then he continues on, he shows the alternative. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. The arrogance is that you control tomorrow. That kind of hits it home right there. You control your income, you control your relationships, you control your stability, you control your health. Now, if you're sitting there, you go, yeah, I control a lot of that. But you know, and some of you have experienced this, until you don't. You always do. It always works until it doesn't. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him, it is sin. Now we're going to jump in, we're going to explore kind of what the issue is that James is getting at. I think the issue is this, that planning for the future based on trust in my ability to determine the course of future events. So that's a way we can live our lives. That's circle one, with me as the core that holds it all together. And James contrasts that idea with planning my life with Jesus at the center, an issue and a solution. So in those first few verses he shared with us, I want to break down three things for you. And then he's going to take a wild left turn and he's going to get real crazy. And then he's going to come back and he's going to wrap up with something I think we all need to hear. And so it kicks off with this reality. Verse 14, you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. I think the reality and the caution for us in living with me as the control of my life is that I'm unprepared for tomorrow. Now, before we move on, just spend a moment there. When have you been unprepared for tomorrow? I look out and I see stories and lives, and I know some of the things. Some of them you had no control over and they broke your heart. Some of them, they were a response to something you did. They're out there. But if we think that we know what comes tomorrow and it's in our power to hold it all together, we can be left unprepared for tomorrow. Now, I want you to think about a time Share about a time when your plans didn't work out. So this message in James takes us deep, and I'm going to try to bring us up from time to time just so we can wrestle with it. But turn to someone next to you. What was a time, share about a time when your plans didn't work out, but to set the stage for you, maybe super inappropriately. How many of you did your parents, probably your mom, say to you, make sure you wear underwear, you never know what's going to happen? Any of us? Okay, I thought it was a universal thing. It's like 5 of us. Well, we had loving parents who knew the truth. You never know what's going to happen. We'll get back to that in a second, but you, share about a time when your plans did not work out, and we'll be back in 1 minute. All right, take a few seconds. Hopefully you're not sitting next to somebody who's like, my plans always work out. So this idea that James is introducing us to, that you know what, if you're not careful, you'll end up unprepared for what comes tomorrow. Now, on a serious level, some of us are trying to keep our head above water with that reality. And others of us are stuck underwater with it. And some of us are maybe a few years beyond that reality. But it's also not all so heavy. Like when I was in elementary school, I really wanted to dress up as a skeleton for Halloween. I lived in a little ski village called Bear Valley. It was 8,000 feet, like 200 people. And there was this Halloween carnival. So my mom took one of our bed sheets. We were pretty poor. She took one of our bed sheets, dyed it with Rit dye, and then made a costume I could wear and put little bones on it, like little cloth bones. And then she said to me, make sure you wear underwear. You never know what'll happen. Well, like any smart young child, I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. This is fine. And then I went to the carnival in the snowstorm, in the 8,000 feet up in the beginning of winter, and right away my costume ripped from like my ankle up to the top of my neck. I'm a kid. This thing scarred me for life. It's why I'm the way I am today. So I spent my whole night like trying to hold this thing together as it ripped in more and more areas. Actually, probably scarred everyone else more than it scarred me. But that's just this one example of how like there's so much wisdom in make sure you wear underwear because you never know what will happen. Now, James, of course, is playing a little deeper. He's inviting us into the real things in life. The things that we feel we're like white knuckling. My life, I'm in control over. I'm looking at it. He says, but you got to be so careful because you won't be prepared for tomorrow. And there's another consequence as well. The other consequence is this: you will be unwisely overconfident. You will think that your winning is your winning. And then when you lose, you will scramble and try to figure out how to keep face and how to keep impressions and how to keep everything going because you are such a winner. You are confident. And James is like, don't be unwisely overconfident. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Now, James is actually not against boasting. He's against boasting in you or me. He actually thinks it's wonderful to say, God is great. God has blessed me. God has challenged me. God is with me in my pain. James is not against boasting. It's the target of your boasting that's the issue. And as a follower of Jesus, you can only imagine that he's thinking about like when Jesus told this parable. Jesus is looking out at crowds and they're trying to figure out what is life. And he says, you know what? There was a guy, he had these great fields. They just produced crops like crazy. He only had a couple barns. And so he put all his crops in his barns and then they were full. Now everyone listening is like, smart guy. And he goes, so he built some more barns. And he said to himself, now that I have all these barns, I'm going to put all my crops in them. I'm going to have so much, and I will eat, and I will drink, and I will be satisfied. Doesn't that feel like a good way to live? Like you're secure, you need nothing, you have safety for the future, you are so confident. And then Jesus said, that night, the man's very life was required of him, and everything he built. Everything he prepared for, everything he saved up was gone. Now, Jesus is talking to people whose lives were always on the edge of being exterminated. They were food insecure. They were housing insecure. They lived under an oppressive rule. And he's saying to them, he's giving them a picture of what sounds like a beautiful life. And he's saying, oh, if you become unwisely overconfident, I see James picking up this thread, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. But Jesus isn't just leaving us out, hanging us out to dry. Listen to how he described where our source, where our confidence in tomorrow comes from. Jesus talking about the life of a follower, a disciple. He says, yes, I am the vine, you are the branches. Notice the black and white distinction he makes there. We're not the branches. We're simply the vine. We draw our source from something in life. We don't get it. He says, I'm the vine, you are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. This is the order Jesus invites us to live into, to know him, to walk with him, to draw close to him. And as you do that, all these aspects of your life start to transform. And Jesus is saying this, and James is jumping on this. Don't boast. Don't be confident in your control about tomorrow, because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. Your life is like a mist. And he again goes on and says, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills. That's an interesting phrase. Because in Jesus' day, it was very popular in Roman culture to end everything by saying, if the gods will it. So you'd be like, hey, I'm going to go meet Sally, if the gods will it. We're having fettuccine tonight, if the gods will it. That's how you lived your life. James is in that culture, but he's like, oh, no, it's that idea, but that was just a colloquial phrase, if the gods will it. James is like, no, it's a real thing. If you turn your attention to the idea that God is the one holding your life together, then you'll begin to reflect on and think about all throughout your day, is this what God wills? See, one thing produces the other. If the Lord wills it, if God wills it, and then you turn and go, what should I do with my life? It's not just say this little sentence and you'll somehow master the universe. And so with that idea in mind, it brings us to the third kind of consequence and challenge with thinking we control our lives. And it's this: you become unaware of God's plan. And he ends with this phrase: so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him, it is sin. And it's beautiful to think about that James is taking an idea of sin. And you might think of sin, I'm going to just say the word, don't shout it out, but what pops in your head? Sin. Most of you is probably something bad. And maybe they're opposite things. You each had a different bad thing and they were the opposite of each other. I don't know. But sin is this interesting thing where we kind of think of sin as just whatever the bad stuff people do that I don't do. Or maybe you're like, oh, the bad stuff I do, I don't want people to know I do. But James's understanding of sin is much deeper than that. He's like, the world is too fractured for you to hold it together. That's sin. It's a separation between us and God, the one who holds the world together. It's a separation between us and our own heart, our own soul, our own identity. So we scramble and try to shape and create what's my identity without ever asking God, what's my identity? And then that becomes a separation between us and other people. We start to just have conflict. And generally they're people we love deeply, and they're also people that we don't even know. And that leads to conflict between us and the resources around us. Sin, it's a big word, it's a big idea. It's at the source of everything we hate in life, and sometimes it looks like actions you and I do. But James is like, did you know, though? It's not just like don't kill people and we'll just stick with the bad one. We've been picking on people who kill people a lot here. So it's not like just don't kill people. He's actually saying there's good God wants you to do. And if you miss that, you're just contributing in this brokenness that's at play everywhere around us all of the time. It makes us unaware of God's plan. I think this reminder is an important one. There was a season of my life, and I stopped doing this. I do it a little bit now. I don't know why I stopped. Even as I talked about the first service, I was like, I should just do that. I began every day, and I was like, God, I want to follow you today. I want to treat people the way you want me to treat people. I want to think. I want to keep thoughts that are destructive out and thoughts that tear people down out, and I want to bring life to people. I want to extend forgiveness. I also want to be strong for people who need me to be strong. And I started my day and I said, Lord, if it's your will. And then what happened is that triggered within me something. Throughout the day, every interaction I had, I'd go, what does God want me to do? And it's not overly complicated. Jesus says the secret to life, what God wants you to do is love God and love your neighbors. And your neighbors include your enemies. And it started to shift how I looked at people, especially people who annoyed me, people I had conflict with, people who had hurt me, people who were getting in the way of the good things I wanted to accomplish. Started to shift that. And I want to go back to that where I began to say, God, what's your, now this is sort of a grand phrase, but I don't mean God's plan. I mean like his day-to-day in the details, opportunity for you to live differently, to bring more good, to bring hope and encouragement, to receive forgiveness and to receive grace and to give forgiveness and grace. He's going to turn a corner here to highlight the challenge, and the corner is dramatic. Are you ready for the corner? Those of you who know the Old Testament and know the prophets, you're going to feel like James just got on his soapbox, all right? Listen to what he does. Behold. So he just says all of that. Friends, you don't know what tomorrow brings. Your life is a mist. You ought to live your day saying, if God wills, and don't miss out on the good he wants you to do. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. How did he get there? Let me read the whole section for you. It's not going to be on the screen. I just want you to hear it. This is where he turns. Chapter 5, he starts this. Come now, you rich, weep. You're going to be so encouraged by the time this is done. Weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. And you can almost picture James thinking about Jesus when Jesus said, you can't serve two things. You can't serve God, and the word he used was mammon. We often see it in the Bible as money, but it's basically everything you trust for your life. You can't serve both of those. And then he goes on to say, where your treasure is, there your heart is. So store up treasure that can't be destroyed by moths and rust. And then listen to James' language. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you. And, he's on a roll, will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasures for the last day. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, this is very similar to the language prophets would use in the Old Testament. Very illustrative and graphic and painting a picture that you're missing something. And then James gets practical. He says, behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. And verse 5 and 6, he says, you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter, and you have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Yikes. Like, it's a real turn of events right there. I mean, maybe you have a conversation with someone that's like that. You're having a great conversation. How's your day? It's beautiful. What do you want to do? Awesome. You know what? Let me tell you about, and they just turn the corner. That's a little bit what James just did. But he's getting at something. I want to take you back to this. Now, James is one of his favorite topics is the use of money, giving our heart over to our resources, and withholding goodness from other people. It's a topic James comes back to over and over and over and over. But if you step out of because you might listen and go, well, I'm not rich, I don't do that, I don't have people who mow my lawn and I don't withhold payment to them. And imagine the tension if one of your kids mowed one of your lawns and you withheld payment, and that's the church, and we're trying to figure this out on a Sunday morning. What happens is, I think James is actually saying, here's the deal. When you hold it all together, you determine how you're going to utilize these things. So you determine how you use your resources. You determine how you use your faith. You determine what you do with your community and your tradition and your rootedness, with your success, with your emotions and with your heart and your well-being. And when that's your system, then scarcity is always at your door because there's probably not enough. And it produced in the life of followers of Jesus who knew better a type of living that withheld goodness, withheld what they owed to other people. But don't get caught on the money because you will miss. We do this with every area of our lives. And James is going to say, did you know if you live your life under God's care and concern, if you plan your life by following Jesus, then you step into that plan, it changes things, and the whole system shifts. Everybody you know is impacted by that decision, including the laborers who work in your fields. Everybody you know is touched and impacted by a reality of a life lived under the care and concern of God. And everybody you know is impacted by a life lived under the care and concern of you or me. And again, this works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, things start to fall apart. You can't hold it together. This holds together so many things in life that don't. work. And so with that, James's illustration, that's all we're going to say about what he does there. He gets intense. He uses Old Testament prophet language. He tells people their skin's going to melt off, and only people who saw Raiders of the Lost Ark even knows what that looks like. And then he goes on, and he gets real practical. He says, so be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives, and pay attention to this line, early and the late rains. If you've got that journal Bible, like underline that, early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. And as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, and every time you see brothers, it's like family. Take the prophet who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. And James gives this like, so what am I supposed to do if I'm not in control of my life? If I'm just a mist, or another translation is a smoke that can just blow away. What am I supposed to do with my life? Am I supposed to not plan? He's not advocating for that at all. He's advocating for where we plan and who we plan with and where we put the trust for our plan. And he knows, because remember, people he loves, he's watched them die for their beliefs. They have been caught up in a famine. They don't have food. They have no authority. They were dispersed. The people reading this letter lost their homes and got sent out to other cities. And he's trying to say, so what does it mean to follow Jesus when that's the state of your life? Few things that I think James invites us into using this really powerful imagery, living between the rains. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. And when James wrote this, there was only one way you could ever get a crop. And then people depended on our crops like we do. The only way you could get it was to count on the rains. Now in the spring, there was almost always rain. That rain would come, and then the farmers would know it's time to plant, it's time to sow our seed. And then they would have to trust and wait. There was nothing they could do to bring the second rain. And sometimes they'd have to wait long. That rain would be delayed, and they would wait, and they'd wait. And James gives this imagery to say, that's what life is like. In particular, he's writing to followers of Jesus. And he would be saying, like, you received Jesus, the first rain. You're like, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus. He goes, but life still goes on. What are you going to do while you're waiting? What are you going to do while you suffer? What are you going to do when things seem out of your control? He goes, well, you're going to wait like the farmer who knows that the late rain is coming. And then he tells what that looks like. I'd encourage you, go back this week. If this even your first time looking at the Bible, go back and look at these passages. This imagery has so much invitation for us to suffer well. Here's the things James invites us to do. The first thing he says is make a commitment to trusting the seasons. Be patient, therefore, until the coming of the Lord. There will be seasons. There will be early rain. There will be waiting. There will be later rain. There will be times when you feel like your life is on fire with goodness. And there are times when you feel like it's on fire with pain. Make a commitment to trusting the seasons. And not like I do. Like I'm already over winter and ready for spring. Anybody else there with me? All right? I'm like some of you are more righteous than I am. You're like, I love winter. See me in a few more weeks. And then spring around here is like 16 seasons. I've learned that by this point. So the season, but you make a commitment to being like, this is the season I'm in. I'm going to carry swim shorts and a snow jacket with me in the spring because it's the season I'm in. Make a commitment to trusting the season. Friends, if we could step back and go, I'm going to do this with my life. I'm going to stop seeing everything is up and to the right. I'm going to start to realize that life is seasons. I'm going to make a commitment to those seasons. And I might wait for those rains a lot longer than my neighbor. That just might be the life I live. But I'm going to wait. I'm going to make a commitment to those seasons. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a habit of remembering God's faithfulness. And this is what James says. After he talks about the farmer, he says, be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. This is a fantastic habit. If you every day, even if you would consider yourself maybe irreligious or deeply connected to a thriving relationship with Jesus, wherever you are in that space, if every day you would go, I want to look for something beyond myself, I'm going to look for where God's been faithful in my life. I'm going to write it down. I'm going to record it because we forget and we move on. And James is like, you've got to remember that this promise from God, it's been floating around in human existence for thousands of years. And James is still calling that Jesus is making all things new. So make a habit of remembering God's faithfulness. That's the second thing he tells us, how we're supposed to live out in this life. And then the third thing he says, you got to make enemies with unhelpful anger. It says it right here. I mean, in a different way, but do not grumble against one another. Now, here's what's key. Not all anger is unhelpful. Some anger is necessary, but I would suspect that we would assume all of our anger is probably the necessary kind. And James makes it real practical. Don't grumble against one another. You have to decide that if you're going to be angry, start by being angry at your stupid anger. Start there. It's not helpful. Make enemies with it. Push it to the side. Don't let it control you. Don't let it be your lead. And I know we might be thinking about like in our relationships right now, but it stretches out beyond our relationships. It stretches out to when we're just sitting all alone looking at a news feed or a Twitter feed and we just get angry at people. James is like, this is the life with me trying to hold it all together. But when God's holding it all together, I get to let go. And instead of unhelpful anger, I get it to institute two things into the circle that God holds together: grace and forgiveness. I'm never going to assume someone is the way they are because they're an idiot. I'm always going to assume they have a story. I'm never going to look at someone else and go, if I was in your shoes, I'd be way better. Jesus doesn't invite us into that. Make enemies with unhelpful anger. If you're struggling here, I'd say first assume most of your anger is unhelpful. Start there, and then wrestle with it. Because there is a place for righteous, well-directed anger about things that break God's heart and break your heart. There's a place for that, but that's not most of what leads us out. Make enemies with unhelpful anger. And the last thing is this. I was talking to Katie this week, and she gave me this language. I think it's great. Make friends with dead people. Some of you are like, what kind of church am I at right now? This is how James ends this section. He said, as an example of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. The prophets are all dead. James is saying, look at the prophets. I think it's even more specific. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job. Now, if you were here in week 2, James introduced this whole letter by saying, consider it pure joy when you face trials, because the trials in your life will produce steadfastness. And steadfastness will make you whole, lacking nothing. He returns to that idea right here, and he goes, look at Job. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purpose of the Lord. Make friends with dead people. This is what James would have heard. Let me just share a couple of the words of Job. Job 13:15. He says, though God destroy me, yet I will trust him. And James is saying, take a look at Job's life. He lost everything. Though God destroy me, yet I will trust him. If the circle is me controlling everything and God starts to destroy me, I throw him out because he's not working in my circle. But if I'm under his care and concern and I feel like he uses the word slaying me, I know he's good. Jesus, we can trust he's good because Jesus even said, if you want to know who the Father is, God, look at me. If you look at Jesus, Jesus is good. And Job goes on and says in chapter 19, says, I know my Redeemer lives, and he will stand at last on the earth. And after my flesh or my skin is destroyed, after my body dies, this I know, that I will see God. I will see him for myself. My eyes will behold him, and my heart will yearn within me. James is inviting people to say, make friends with dead people. Find authors and leaders and biographers and autobiographers and the people in Scripture and the story of God and dig in. Find hope in stories of people who have been where you are. Suffering, there are people who have suffered in like ways and can point you to God is good. He was with me. I always think of one of my first introductions to Christianity was someone who suffered in a Nazi internment camp. Her name was Corrie ten Boom. And Corrie had this line, no matter how deep the pit you're in, Jesus is deeper. And she said that from a Nazi prison camp. I heard that. I'm like, is that what God's like? Because tell me, I want my life to be held together like that. So we're going to wrap up, and I was trying to think, like, what's James getting at? Anyone know what this is? Yeah, say anything, right? Lloyd and his love. And some of you are like, what 50-year-old had a boombox? This is from a young adult, by the way. None of you had boomboxes. So this is how this works, okay? You may not be familiar with this, but this is an antenna. And this antenna picks up frequencies, and these frequencies dial you in clearly to a voice or a song, and that voice is what you want to listen to. And I think this is what James is getting at through this whole thing. He's like, look, there's no magic button here if the Lord wills. But if the Lord wills, is this idea of listening to and looking at God every moment of my lives. And when I do that, I'm tuning in, I'm finding, there's going to be voices that come in, I'm like, oh, that's not it, and the risk is high. I have no idea what's about to play on here. But you have to do the work. You start by realizing that the frequencies are always there. I just want to find them. I want to hear from God. I want to know what I should do in this situation. And I reach out to those things. Let's turn this on here and see what happens. All right. What is that, little Michael Franti to kick us off? So what happens, if you're my age, this was the story of your life for a long time. You want to turn, like if you're driving your car and you leave your county and all your presets are gone. You're like, oh, I got to find new ones and I got to work through this. And I'm not even that old, you guys, so stop judging me, okay? So what happens is a life of faith, which James is inviting us to do, is like, it's a life where we attune to and pay attention to the voice of God in our lives. And so that's going to include things like prayer, community, service. It's going to include things like a regular habit of reading scripture and doing it with open hands, not to find like, here's my answer, but to read it and allow it to shape our lives. And the more we do those things, some of you are like, oh, okay. The more you do those things, that process tunes us in. Oh, no, that's not the voice we want. So we keep going because there's a lot of voices out there, aren't there? No, that's not it. We just keep. And you find it. And you start to follow it. And you do that. And sometimes you shift and you shift and you lose it.
Where you can't tell new
You
ones.
lose it. So you do the work. And you get back to it. I don't know what's coming next. I better turn it down. That's what James is inviting us to do with our lives. Attune to a God who loves us, to Jesus Christ. We think he's irresistible. He wants to hold our lives together under his care and his concern. But there is an option for us to just do it. And that option works until it doesn't. Over and over and over. So maybe this whole morning, like none of this makes sense. Your life's probably working really well. And some of you, your life was working and something happened. The circle collapsed. All of us will eventually face, and this is what's on the mind of all of the authors of the Bible, will eventually face death. And we're made for eternal life. So what's next? What's next? And that uncertainty falls to all of us. So I just want to give you, this was the two things James was testing, the two ideas. Skilled living is to have no other will, no other wisdom than to follow Jesus wherever he leads. And I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul. In just a moment, we're going to share a time of communion together. And I invite you to reflect on these two. Which one more describes your life? And is it working for you? And we gather here, and this place exists because we believe deeply that Jesus is irresistible. One of the things that we say, we borrow it from someone else, is following Jesus makes your life better and makes you better at life. And you might hear that and go, oh, better? But no, really, like in everything, in your pain and your suffering, in your hope and your winning, Jesus, you tune into him, and he is the voice that you follow. So where are you? Which one's working for you? Is this one working for you? Because, man, it's inspiring. But sometimes the things that are really inspiring are the things that don't hold up. So we'll come back in just a minute. We'll give you a minute to prayerfully reflect on this, to think about it, and then we're going to come back and share a time of communion. About once a month, we spend a Sunday morning kind of living in